Dinner parties are supposed to be elegant, peaceful affairs, not ground zero for a bruised ego. When my husband's loudest, most obnoxious friend decided to belittle my military service over a medium-rare ribeye, he didn't just cross a line, he triggered a response, usually reserved for hostile combatants. Growing up, the smell of starch and boot polish was as common in our house as the scent of morning coffee. My father, Arthur Mitchell, was a decorated colonel in the 82nd Airborne Division. He was a man made of granite and rigid principles, who raised me as a single father after my mother passed away. He didn't raise a delicate princess, he raised a soldier. By the time I was 12, I could strip and reassemble an M4 carbine, read a topographical map better than most Boy Scouts, and understood the uncompromising value of discipline. I followed in his footsteps, commissioning as an officer in the United States Army. I was proud to be my father's daughter, proud to wear the uniform, and proud of my rank as captain. My husband David is the complete opposite of the military world, which is exactly why I fell in love with him. He's an architect, soft-spoken, incredibly patient, and creative. He builds things up, whereas my job, working as a combat engineer, often involves figuring out how to blow things up. We balance each other perfectly, but David has one glaring flaw, and his name is Trent. Trent was David's college roommate. While David outgrew his frat boy phase the moment he graduated, Trent had somehow weaponized his. Trent was a software sales executive who worshipped at the altar of alpha male podcasts, drove a leased Porsche he couldn't afford, and possessed a voice that completely lacked an indoor volume setting. He was a man entirely fueled by his own insecurities, masking them behind an aggressive, overbearing personality. I tolerated him for David's sake, but tonight, my tactical patience was about to run out. It was a crisp Saturday evening in October, and David and I were hosting a small dinner party to celebrate our 3rd wedding anniversary. We had invited our close friends, Greg and Sarah, along with Trent and his new girlfriend, Bethany. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing a prime rib roast, setting the dining room table with our best silverware, and chilling the wine. I wanted the evening to be perfect, especially since I had just returned from a grueling 9-month deployment in the Middle East. I was craving normalcy. I was craving peace. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:30 p.m. I smoothed down my emerald green cocktail dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Greg and Sarah were standing there, holding a beautiful bouquet of lilies and a bottle of Pinot Noir. But pushing past them, before they could even say hello, was Trent. "The conquering hero returns!" Trent bellowed, his voice echoing off our foyer's high ceiling. He was wearing a designer blazer over a tight black t-shirt, completely ignoring the formal casual dress code. He grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me into a suffocating, awkward hug, slapping my back a little too hard. "Look at you, little G.I. Jane, playing dress-up in civilian clothes. Almost didn't recognize you without the combat boots and the resting bitch face." I stiffened, my father's voice instantly echoing in my head. "Control the battlefield, Jess. Never let the enemy dictate your emotional response." "Hello, Trent," I said, stepping back and flashing a polite, entirely hollow smile. "It's good to see you too. And this must be Bethany." Bethany, a petite, nervous-looking woman in a floral dress, offered a timid wave. "Hi, Jessica. It's so nice to finally meet you. David speaks the world of you." Yeah, the world," Trent interrupted, tossing his coat onto the pristine entryway bench without aiming for a hanger. "So, did you shoot anybody over there, or were you just doing paperwork in an air-conditioned tent the whole time?" "I hear that's what the women usually do." The foyer went dead silent. Greg and Sarah exchanged a horrified look. David, who had just walked out of the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel, stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw clenching. I looked at Trent. He had a smug, challenging smirk on his face. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to rattle me. But I had spent the last 9 months dealing with arrogant local warlords, sleep deprivation, and the constant threat of indirect fire. A mid-level software salesman from Chicago wasn't even going to register on my threat matrix. "I managed my platoon and completed my mission, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any warmth. "Why don't you head into the living room?" "David is mixing drinks." Trent scoffed, clearly disappointed that I hadn't taken the bait. "Right on. Hey, Dave, Tell me you got that Japanese whiskey I told you about. None of that cheap stuff. As Trent swaggered into the living room, Bethany gave me an apologetic, embarrassed look before scurrying after him. David stepped up beside me, wrapping a warm arm around my waist and pressing a kiss to my temple. "I am so sorry," David whispered, his voice tight with frustration. "If he says one more thing, I'm kicking him out. Anniversary or not." "Stand down, architect," I murmured, leaning into him for a brief second. "I can handle Trent. He's just loud. Loud usually means weak." But as we moved into the living room and the evening progressed, I realized I had underestimated just how far Trent was willing to push. By the time we moved to the dining room to eat, the atmosphere in the house was thicker than the gravy I had prepared for the prime rib. Trent had spent the entire cocktail hour dominating the conversation, bragging about his commission checks, his supposed grueling gym routine, and his killer instinct in the corporate world. He took the seat at the head of the table before David could even pull a chair out. It was a subtle, primitive dominance play, but I caught it immediately. I caught David's eye and gave a micro shake of my head. Let him have it. It doesn't matter. I took my seat next to David, directly across from Trent and Bethany. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was relatively safe. Greg talked about his new law firm and Sarah shared pictures of their golden retriever puppy. The food was excellent and the wine was flowing. But Trent, apparently feeling starved of attention, decided to pivot the conversation back to his favorite subject, himself, and his distorted view of masculinity. "I'm just saying," Trent said loudly, pointing a piece of asparagus at Greg like a spear. "Modern men are getting soft. Too much feelings, not enough action. You need that warrior mindset. You have to wake up every day ready to go to war." That's how I approach my sales quotas. It's life or death out there in the market. I took a slow sip of my red wine, feeling a headache beginning to form at the base of my skull. Life or death in software sales? I thought, remembering the metallic taste of dust in my mouth during a mortar attack outside of Erbil. "I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, Trent," David said calmly, slicing his steak. "Sales is stressful, sure, but nobody is shooting at you." Trent laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Dave, buddy, you wouldn't get it. You draw houses for a living. It's fine. Society needs guys like you. But out there, in the real trenches, it takes a certain type of alpha to survive. You need grit, something most people today just don't have." He paused, his eyes sliding over to me, gleaming with malicious intent. Present company included, of course. "No offense, Jess." The clinking of silverware stopped. Sarah dropped her fork. "Excuse me?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously soft. Trent leaned back in his chair, swirling the expensive red wine in his glass. "Come on, let's be real. Everyone respects the troops. Thank you for your service and all that. But the military has gone totally soft. It's a social experiment now, lowering physical standards so women can pass, handing out participation trophies. It's not like the old days." "Trent, that is completely out of line," David said, his voice rising, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You need to apologize to Jessica right now." "Dave, relax." Trent waved him off, rolling his eyes. "I'm just having an intellectual debate. Jess is a big girl, she can handle it. Right, Captain? I'm just saying if a real war kicked off, a ground war, they aren't sending you to kick down doors. Your logistics or engineering or whatever, you're checking spreadsheets. It's basically corporate HR, but in camouflage. My father's training kicked in again. When the enemy exposes their flank, do not strike immediately. Let them overextend. Let them show everyone exactly who they are. My unit clears explosive hazards and builds defensive fighting positions under fire, Trent," I said evenly, holding his gaze without blinking. "We don't do HR, but I'm curious. You seem to know an awful lot about military standards and combat readiness. Where did you serve?" A flicker of hesitation crossed Trent's face, but he quickly masked it with a condescending smile. "I didn't. I thought about it, obviously. I talked to a recruiter out of high school, but honestly, I would have punched the drill sergeant in the face the first time he got in my grill. I have a problem with authority. I'm a lone wolf. Plus, I was making too much money by the time I was 22 to go shave my head and sleep in the mud for pennies." "I see," I replied, my tone dripping with polite venom. So, your warrior mindset is entirely theoretical. Bethany let out a nervous little squeak of a cough, sinking lower into her chair. It's not theoretical, it's practical application in the business theater, Trent snapped, his face flushing a mottled red. My buddy Kyle, he was a Navy SEAL. We work out together sometimes. He told me straight up, my mental toughness is on par with the guys he went through Bud S with. He said if I had joined, I would have easily made Tier 1. Greg, who couldn't hold it in anymore, let out a loud snort of laughter. Trent, you pulled a hamstring last month helping me move a couch. That was a structural imbalance in the floor. Trent shot back, pointing an angry finger at Greg, and I still pushed through the pain. That's what I'm talking about, pure grit. Something you get from being pushed to the limit. Look at Jess. No offense, but you look like you weigh 130 pounds soaking wet. You're telling me you could carry a grown man out of a firefight? Please, it's biology. Women just aren't built for the violence of action. Trent, I'm going to ask you to leave, David said, his voice dropping an octave, standing up from his chair. No, David, sit down, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried a command presence that instantly made David pause. I didn't take my eyes off Trent. Trent smirked, thinking he had won, thinking he had established his dominance. Yeah, Dave, sit down. Your wife and I are just talking. Look, Jess, I'm not saying you aren't brave for putting on the uniform. I'm just saying, let's not pretend you and I are on the same level when it comes to handling real, physical threats. I'm an apex predator in my world. You're playing by a set of modified rules. I slowly placed my napkin on the table. My heart rate hadn't elevated above resting. I felt that icy, hyper-focused calm that washes over you when the chaotic noise of the world drops away, leaving only the tactical reality of the situation. Trent was a bully. He was a coward who used volume and aggression to cover up a deep, pathetic insecurity. He had come into my home, eaten my food, disrespected my husband, and insulted everything my father and I had dedicated our lives to. He didn't need to be kicked out. He needed to be dismantled. An apex predator, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. I tilted my head, looking at him as if he were a particularly fascinating insect pinned to a corkboard. Tell me, Trent, since you're so mentally tough, so built for the violence of action, how do you usually respond to acute psychological pressure? When the business theater goes completely off script? I dominate it, Trent said, though his smirk faltered slightly under my unblinking stare. I take control. Good to know, I said, a slow, predatory smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. Because I knew something Trent didn't. I knew that Trent's SEAL buddy Kyle was actually a guy he met at a CrossFit gym who washed out of Navy boot camp for a fraudulent asthma claim. I also knew, thanks to David's reluctant venting over the years, that Trent was deeply claustrophobic and completely fell apart in situations he couldn't control. But I wasn't going to just expose his lies. I was going to let him expose himself. And the universe, it seemed, had impeccable timing. Because right at that moment, the motion sensor lights flooding our backyard violently flicked on, and a heavy, frantic pounding started against our sliding glass patio door. The pounding was frantic, desperate, and entirely out of place in our quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the heavy, open-palmed slapping of someone terrified, accompanied by a muffled, frantic shouting that we couldn't quite make out through the double-paned glass. For a fraction of a second, the dining room was paralyzed. The contrast between Trent's boastful apex predator monologue and the sudden injection of real-world chaos was blinding. Then, two things happened simultaneously. First, a deafening crack split the air outside, so loud it vibrated the silverware on the table. A lightning strike had hit the main power transformer at the end of our street. It sounded remarkably like a 155mm artillery shell detonating at a distance. Instantly, every light in the house and the neighborhood died. We were plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Second, Trent screamed. It wasn't a manly shout of surprise or a tactical bark to take cover. It was a high-pitched, guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. Get down! Someone's shooting! They're breaking in! Trent bellowed, his voice cracking hysterically. My eyes hadn't adjusted to the dark yet, but my muscle memory didn't need light. My chair scraped backward as I dropped low to the floor, instantly scanning for the nearest exit and assessing the threat. My father's training kicked in, a cold wave of adrenaline washing away the annoyance of the dinner party, leaving only sharp, crystalline focus. Breathe. Assess. React. Nobody is shooting, it was a transformer, David yelled over the darkness, his voice steady but tense. He knew the drill. I heard a sudden scuffle, the heavy thud of a chair hitting the floor, and a sharp cry of pain from Bethany. "Trent, what the hell are you doing? You stepped on me!" Bethany cried out from the floor near the table. "Move! Get out of my way!" Trent shrieked, his heavy footsteps thumping frantically against the hardwood floor, retreating away from the patio door, away from the perceived threat, and toward the back hallway. "David, grab the emergency maglite from the kitchen drawer," I commanded, my voice cutting through the panic with flat, absolute authority. "Greg, stay down with Sarah and Bethany. Do not move." I didn't wait for a response. I low-crawled the 15 feet from the dining room to the edge of the living room, keeping my silhouette below the window line. The frantic pounding on the glass resumed, weaker this time, accompanied by a wet, sliding sound. David slid next to me in the dark, pressing the heavy, aircraft aluminum tactical flashlight into my hand. "I'm going to illuminate the target," I whispered to David. "Stay behind the wall concealment. On 3, 1, 2, 3. I rolled out from the wall, brought the flashlight up, and clicked the high beam switch. A blinding cone of white light pierced the darkness, hitting the sliding glass door. It wasn't a home invader. It wasn't an assassin sent to test Trent's combat readiness. It was Mr. Henderson, our 72-year-old neighbor from across the street. He was slumped against the glass, his face smeared with a terrifying amount of deep crimson blood. He was clutching his chest, his eyes wide and shocked in the glare of the flashlight. "David, unlock the door. Pull him in. Greg, call 911 immediately," I barked, transitioning instantly from a defensive posture to combat lifesaver mode. David threw the latch and dragged the older man inside out of the pouring rain that had suddenly begun to fall. Mr. Henderson collapsed onto our living room rug. "Mr. Henderson, it's Jessica. Can you hear me?" I asked, dropping to my knees beside him, shoving my ruined emerald cocktail dress out of the way. I handed the flashlight to David to act as a spotlight. Slipped. Fell on the concrete edge of the retaining wall. Mr. Henderson wheezed, his hands trembling. My phone. Dead. Power went out. Couldn't see. Bled so much. Head wounds are notorious bleeders, but in the dark, with the frantic pounding, it had looked like a horror movie. I quickly ran my hands over his skull, finding a deep 3-inch laceration near his hairline. "Sarah, grab the trauma kit from the hall closet, top shelf, red bag. Move!" I shouted. Sarah, bless her, didn't freeze. She scrambled up and sprinted for the closet, returning seconds later with my fully stocked military-issue blowout kit. I ripped open a packet of quick-clot combat gauze and pressed it hard into the wound on the older man's head. "Hold this, David. Hard pressure. Do not let up," I instructed, guiding his hands to the dressing. I checked Mr. Henderson's vitals. His pulse was rapid but strong, his breathing shallow from the panic, but his pupils were responsive to the ambient light from the flashlight. He wasn't dying, but he was in shock. "Greg, what's the ETA on the ambulance?" I asked, pulling an emergency Mylar blanket from the kit and wrapping it around Mr. Henderson's shivering shoulders. 5 minutes, Greg said, his voice shaking as he held his glowing cell phone. "They said the storm is slowing them down, but they're coming." "Good. You all did exactly what you needed to do," I said, finally allowing a small, reassuring sliver of warmth into my voice. It was then, in the relative quiet following the chaos, that Bethany spoke up. She was sitting on the floor by the dining table, rubbing her bruised shoulder where Trent had violently shoved her out of the way to facilitate his own escape. "Where is Trent?" she asked, her voice trembling not from fear of the situation, but from a terrifying realization about the man she was dating. The house was completely silent, save for the heavy rain beating against the roof. The apex predator, the man who claimed he possessed a warrior mindset forged in the boardroom, was entirely missing in action. 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance illuminated our front lawn. The paramedics took over, commending our rapid response and the proper use of hemostatic gauze. As they loaded a stabilized, heavily bandaged Mr. Henderson onto the stretcher, the neighborhood lights flickered and suddenly buzzed back to life. The sudden illumination was jarring. The living room looked like a triage center, bloody gauze wrappers on the floor, muddy footprints, and my beautiful rug completely ruined. David, Greg, Sarah, and Bethany were all pale, their formal clothes rumpled and stained. But Trent was still nowhere to be found. "Did he run out the front door?" Greg asked, looking around in bewilderment. "No," David said, his jaw tight. "The deadbolt was still locked when I let the paramedics in." I picked up the tactical flashlight, its heavy weight familiar and comforting in my hand. "Let's clear the house. He's hiding." We didn't have to look far. At the back of the hallway, near the garage entrance, was a small windowless closet tucked awkwardly under the staircase. We used it to store winter coats, a vacuum cleaner, and bulk paper towels. It was cramped, dark, and highly claustrophobic. I stood in front of the door. I could hear a frantic, shallow wheezing coming from the other side. "Trent," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the thin wood. "The threat has been neutralized. You can come out of the bunker." There was a moment of silence, followed by the rattling of the doorknob. "It's stuck." Trent's voice came out as a pathetic, panicked squeak. I pulled it shut and it jammed. "Get me out of here!" "I can't breathe in here." David stepped forward, his face a mask of utter contempt. He reached out, grabbed the knob, gave it a firm wiggle to bypass the old, sticky latch, and pulled the door open. The sight was something I will never forget. Trent, the software sales titan, the lone wolf, the man who was too mentally tough for the military, was curled into a literal fetal position on the floor, wedged between a Hoover vacuum and a 12-pack of Bounty paper towels. His expensive designer blazer was torn at the elbow. His face was streaked with sweat and tears, his chest heaving as he battled a full-blown claustrophobic panic attack. He scrambled backward like a crab as the light hit him, throwing his arms up to shield his face. We all just stood there, staring down at him. The silence was heavier than the darkness had been. Nobody laughed. Nobody sneered. The absolute, pathetic reality of his cowardice was too profound for mockery. Bethany pushed her way past Greg. She looked down at Trent, her eyes traveling from his tear-stained face to the bruised shoulder he had given her when he used her as a human shield to escape the dining room. "You pushed me," Bethany said, her voice eerily calm. "You literally threw me to the ground so you could run and hide in a closet from an old man knocking on a window." Trent scrambled to his feet, knocking over the vacuum cleaner in a loud clatter. He tried to straighten his ruined jacket, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. He looked around at our faces, desperately trying to construct a narrative that would save his ego. I was securing a tactical position," Trent stammered, his voice still shaky, but attempting to find its usual booming volume. "I didn't have a weapon. In a fluid combat situation, you have to establish a stronghold and—" "Shut up, Trent," David interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register I rarely heard. "Just shut up. You shoved Bethany, you abandoned everyone, and you hid." "Look, you guys don't understand the psychology of an ambush," Trent pleaded, looking wildly at Greg for support. But Greg just turned his head away in disgust. My survival instincts took over. "It's an alpha response. You have to ensure your own survival to fight another day." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was well inside his personal space. I looked up into his panicked, red-rimmed eyes. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, devastating precision of a sniper, taking a calculated shot. "You are a coward, Trent," I said softly, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "And that's fine. Not everyone is built for pressure. But a real man, a real leader, doesn't mock the people who stand on the wall for him, only to cower behind women and paper towels the second he thinks his own skin is on the line." I stepped back, pointing toward the front door. "Your coat is on the bench. Your tactical retreat from this house begins now." Trent opened his mouth to argue, to deploy some sales tactic or psychological spin, but he looked at my face, then at David's clenched fists, and finally at Bethany's disgusted sneer. The fight completely drained out of him. The illusion was shattered. He didn't say another word. He grabbed his coat from the foyer, keeping his eyes glued to the floor, and practically ran out the front door into the rain. Bethany stayed. We poured a fresh round of drinks, ordered late-night delivery since the prime rib was cold, and spent the rest of the night talking, laughing, and helping Bethany block Trent's number on her phone. My father always taught me that you don't really know who a person is until the bullets start flying. In Trent's case, it didn't even take bullets. It just took a blown transformer and an elderly neighbor needing help. I never saw Trent again. He stopped returning David's calls, presumably too humiliated to face the architect and the little G.I. Jane who had watched his alpha male facade crumble into dust. As I swept up the dirt from the hallway the next morning, my combat boots laced tight, I smiled. The military taught me how to disarm explosive devices. But sometimes, the most effective way to diffuse a toxic ego is simply to turn off the lights and let them dismantle themselves. True strength isn't about how loud you can shout in a safe room. It's about how quietly and effectively you act when the world goes dark. If this story of fake bravado meeting real-world reality resonated with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who knows the value of true resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories of drama, karma, and the unspoken lessons of everyday life. Stay strong and stay ready.